to talk to you about how Miles Davis actually used Agile management techniques in his recording of his famous album, Bitches Brew. So for those of you who don't know who Miles is, he was the Picasso of jazz. Like Picasso, he went through multiple styles, many of which he invented, from cool jazz to hard bop to finally jazz rock fusion in the late 60s. And I'm going to show that Miles actually did two different Agile things. First, he created time box sprints as a way to investigate his exploration from acoustic jazz to jazz rock fusion. And then when he got into the studio to record Bitches Brew, he actually hired a self-managed team and then used a plan, execute, evaluate cycle during the recording to actually come up with the album. So when I've given this in the past, it's a mixed audience, but for this audience, I don't think I need to explain what this is, but what we want to keep in mind is what's important here is sprints and kind of the Scrum model of plan, execute, evaluate. Okay? So let's go through the albums. Nefertiti was his prototype. This was actually his last pure jazz album. But on this album, he started to explore in one cut something called tone centers, which are an African musical structure much closer to R&B and blues and rock than jazz's standard Western chord progressions. Next was Miles in the Sky in '68. It was his first use of a rock rhythm in a couple tracks, and it was his first use of electric instruments. He had George Benson on guitar and electric bass and keyboards. Next was Feet of Kilimanjaro, and this was really his first extensive exploration into jazz rock fusion. He had electric instruments to about 50% of the album. He was using a lot of rock rhythms, and again, a lot of the songs were either based on blues progressions or on tone centers. In a Silent Way was really his first complete fusion album. And in this, he really combined the music structures of rock, the rock band instrumentation, along with the use of the studio to construct tracks much like the Beatles and the Beach Boys were doing at that time. He also used sections of instruments. So in a rock band, you'd have multiple guitars, multiple keyboards, and this was the first use of that in jazz. All culminating in his release, Bitches Brew, '69. And Bitches Brew was the penultimate fusion album and actually probably the most controversial jazz album of the '70s, as well as the most important. On that album, it was totally rock-based, totally tone center-based. It was his first use of electric instrumentation, and in this he also used the studio as an instrument to construct tracks, and we'll talk about that a little more. So this is a diagram of his sprints, and you can see that he had a prototype and a couple of sprints with a beta and a release, and because Miles was very interested in money, he tried to keep those releases very close together to make sure that he was making his bread on those albums. This is a feature burn-down chart, actually. And in front, the front graph shows the burn-down of the number of rock musicians he was using per track per album, and the back one is the number of rock music features per track per album. So now I want to talk about Bitches Brew recording. So Miles actually publicly stated that his idea was, his user story, was to take what he did in a Silent Way and expand it with more musicians and more jazz improvisation. And so therefore his challenge was, how do I manage that with more musicians and get more innovation? So in Agile, what you do is you hire self-managed teams, which means you hired the best people for the domain that you can afford, and then you stay out of the way. Minimal manage, maximal support. So this is a graph of the people on the album, and you can see that there's bunches of people who had rock experience, which is the horizontal dimension from jazz to rock, and he had a lot of just experienced sidemen by counting the number of recordings that some of these people had made. Miles had one rehearsal for Bitches Brew. And what he did, actually, was he brought everybody into the studio, and he would have them play segments. So they would play something that he directed them at, then they would stop, listen to it, evaluate what they did, and redo it. And they weren't really tracks, they were just segments. And Miles later went to the studio and constructed tracks out of these segments, okay? And there was a quote back there where Jack Dajan actually said, wow, I went into the studio on Bitches Brew and it was really very spiral. It was a kind of a real spiral kind of experience. So he really captured what Miles was doing. So that's it. And you can kind of hear it. Too bad. But go listen to him. Thanks.